Sorry.
Thank you very much, Lauren and Bérangère, for the invitation. It's really nice to see so many familiar names, if not faces, in the audience. So I'm going to share my screen now. Can everybody see my presentation now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So today I want to talk, a little bit about gold in the South Caucasus and what the study of gold and indeed Caucasus metallurgy in general can tell us about broader issues related to technological innovation and rejection. And this is a project that's not so much based out of my fieldwork, but a kind of synthetic look that I really dove into over the course of the last couple of years, in part because with the pandemic, fieldwork was less feasible. So I've been quite interested in the archaeology and anthropology of technology and innovation. And this is something that's a bit of a hot topic over the last couple of years, last decade or so. There's a lot of interest in understanding the kind of the social and technical context that cause people to invent and adopt new technologies. And there are a number of different schools of thought about kind of how to approach this. But in general, to kind of broadly characterize it, I think there's a kind of turn away from this kind of thinking about technology as a sort of linear sequence of kind of ever improving technologies, which is perhaps encapsulated in the kind of display of the various iPhones, evolution of the iPhones, a kind of sequence of one getting thinner and sometimes larger, sometimes more rounded, sometimes more boxy, over the course of time. And so I think that these kind of sequences, which I've kind of alluded to, over here that you see sometimes in kind of earlier formulations of human evolution, this kind of sequence of kind of linear change. And so I think that there's, in the last 10 years especially, but starting even earlier than that, there's been a kind of reassessment of kind of that the technologies don't always follow these kind of linear, predictable, ever-improving kind of paths. And I realized here as I was putting together, I sort of implied that the next stage of human evolution is to become an iPhone 5 or whatever that one is on the left there. But I wanted to kind of draw this analogy with the way that kind of human evolution has moved from this kind of linear sequence to this kind of concept of a sort of braided stream where different populations are recombining, exchanging kind of genes, and kind of it's not a kind of sequence, but this kind of concept of a braided stream. Now I know there's a whole school of thought that kind of takes this evolutionary theory and applies it to technology in a little bit more kind of substantial way. I don't really want to comment too much on that. I have lots of thoughts, but that's somewhat beside the point. But I just want to kind of draw this kind of comparison between the ways in which our understanding of human evolution has changed and kind of ways in which kind of the kind of anthropology of technology has transformed our understanding of technological change as well. And one kind of element of this reconceptualization is that technologies don't always aren't always sort of linear sequences of ever improving technologies. One element of this, of course, is technological discontinuance and rejection, kind of technological what we might think of as dead ends or technologies that are abandoned, technologies that are rejected. And in kind of my terminology here, I want to be kind of quite precise about what I mean. When I'm talking about technological discontinuance, I'm talking about a technology that stops being used after some period of adoption. And that overlaps with the concept of technological rejection, but it's not identical. So rejection is the kind of active choice not to use that technology when it's otherwise available. And this may happen before actually the technology is adopted. So that would be a case with rejection, but not discontinuance. But if technology is rejected after it's been used for some time, that's the kind of area of overlap. And in terms of archaeology, the study of discontinuance and rejection is difficult, but quite I would say quite important. And we'll talk a little bit later about why it's so difficult. But why it's important, I think, is because the study of kind of when technological systems break down actually tells us quite a lot about innovation, why people start using them in the first place. And the analogy that I love to use is with sort of modern day technology, whether it's automotive technology or whatnot. If your car breaks down, you're essentially forced to like figure out what went wrong and how to make it work again. And so, to carry the metaphor a bit further, what I think that the study of technological rejection actually allows us to kind of pull up the hood on a technology and really kind of tinker around and see how it works, see how it's kind of integrated into society, and kind of why it may have spread or in the first place, and why it was subsequently abandoned. So the archaeology of technological discontinuance and rejection is something that is not particularly well studied. There's a general recognition that technologies are abandoned, especially ones that are rejected. There's lots of discussion, lots of examples of delays, pauses, sometimes rejection prior to adoption, a kind of technological resistance, if you will. But there's not a whole lot of examples of technologies being adopted and then being abandoned. And there are a couple of really couple of nice case studies, a few of which I've kind of thrown up here. But in point of fact, it's rather difficult to study these kind of gaps, technological gaps, because in archaeological terms, it's often difficult to tell whether the absence of a particular technology at a certain time is in fact a real technological abandonment or just a change in archaeological visibility. And so we're going to come back to the issue of archaeological visibility when we talk about gold in the Caucasus. In broad terms, and those of you who are familiar with my other work, you know that I've worked on a number of different kinds of metallurgical technologies: bronze, copper, iron. That the Caucasus is one of the premier places in the world to look at metallurgical technology and innovation. It's one of the earliest places in the world to adopt extractive metallurgy. There are also a number of very distinctive ways of making and using metal. The slags over here on the left are an instance of iron smelting technology that is revered by the classical Greeks and kind of mythologized. Actually, it shows up in myth about the Golden Fleece, but they mention iron smelting tribes that they meet along the way. So there's some potential innovation, if not probably not the earliest iron smelting anywhere, but certainly some innovative aspects to the technology. There are also some cases of unusual alloys. So this figure in the middle here has a very high arsenic inlay into a tin bronze, most likely to achieve different kind of color effect in the horse and the warrior there. There's also some entirely new, not entirely exceptional metals, but metals which are found much more in the Caucasus than in other areas of the Near East. And that would be a classic example there is antimony, which is found in pretty significant quantities in the Caucasus, but not so much elsewhere. And in addition to kind of the kind of material technologies, there are also some really interesting results that we have from understanding kind of organizational innovations, ways of organizing the production of metals that differ in some really key ways to areas that are, neighboring contemporary areas. And so the Caucasus is a fascinating place to study this, study metallurgy, because it's kind of close to the Near East and kind of intimately linked with it in some ways, but in other ways, it kind of very much does its own thing. And I think this applies not just to metallurgy, but also to a number of other kind of aspects of the prehistory of the Caucasus. And I think this is most likely one of the reasons why many of us are so fascinated by the region. It's got connections with other areas, but is very much its own distinctive region. So today I want to focus predominantly on gold metallurgy, as alluded to in the introduction. And this, the Caucasus is again one of the earliest places in the world where gold is adopted. It's probably not the earliest. The earliest gold it belonged to the Balkans, several hundred years older than the earliest gold in the Caucasus. But nonetheless, we're still talking about 6,000 years ago. People started extracting and shaping gold into some really fantastic objects. And we have, while the Caucasus may not be it have the earliest gold objects, at present it does have the earliest well-documented gold mine. It's an outstanding German-Georgian project that's been running for many years and has produced really nice evidence of gold mining at about 3000 BC. So as Lauren alluded to in the introduction, gold is very much tied with kind of mythical legends of Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece. For those of you who may not be familiar with this myth, this is the story of the Greek hero Jason, who is dispossessed of his throne by his usurper uncle, and his uncle sends him off to retrieve the Golden Fleece, to the ends of the earth, which at the time was, Caucasus, the eastern edge of the Black Sea, and retrieve this Golden Fleece and come back and win glory and fame and all these sorts of things. Well, he gathered together a band of Greek heroes, which in the kind of mythical chronology is about a generation before the Trojan War. So, if you take this mythical chronology and try and tie it to specific time periods, we're somewhere in the late Bronze Age, maybe 1300-ish BC. Of course, this is entirely mythical, just to be clear. But they go and they retrieve the Golden Fleece. Jason falls in love with the Colchian king's daughter, Medea, and she helps him out, ends up fleeing with him, in classical Greek tragic fashion. He abandons her. She gets quite mad, murders their children. It's a kind of well-known myth in the Greek world, and shows up again and again in the classical period. But what I think is quite fascinating, and this is the kind of root of what I call the Golden Fleece, or one aspect of the Golden Fleece paradox, is that actually, when Jason is supposed to have gone to retrieve the Golden Fleece, say 1300 BC-ish, there's actually not that much gold in Caucasus. And in large parts of the South Caucasus, there's actually quite little gold use. So this is kind of paradoxical. One easy way of resolving this paradox is to say, of course, this myth must have crystallized in the first millennium BC, when there's incredibly elaborate gold working traditions in this very precise area. So you can see this gorgeous diadem from a site called Vani in Caucasus. And perhaps my favorite gold object in the entire Georgia National Museum collection, this beautiful headdress ornament, which is decorated with in a kind of incrustations of gold granulation and kind of open work decoration, a very characteristic sort of Caucasus style of decoration here. So that's one way of resolving one element of this paradox. But I think the larger question, the larger kind of paradox that I want to kind of focus on for the rest of this talk is the fact that okay, we have an elaborate gold working tradition that appears in the kind of Middle Bronze Age, but then seems to dissipate over a large section of the Caucasus, the South Caucasus, in the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, only to return in the first millennium BC. And to kind of give you a sense of kind of the evolution of this kind of obsession of mine with understanding this gap, I went to traveled to the Georgian National Museum, an outstanding museum in Tbilisi, and they have a fantastic kind of treasure room down in the basement. It's dimly lit, artistically highlighted objects, beautiful, beautiful room. And it's filled with gold and silver objects, everything from 3000 BC to the medieval period. And I've been going to this museum a number of times, and I kept noticing that in the corner this museum. There's some excellent, outstanding cases of kind of early and middle Bronze Age gold, and then there's a gap. And then the next case is, kind of later Iron Age and Classical era gold, so from about 800 BC. So there's no actual case for objects dating between about 1500 and 800 BC. And every time I would go to this museum, I would, would notice it and kind of wonder about it. I started kind of talking to people, and then it became clear that it wasn't just a sort of curatorial oversight, and I looked around in the literature, and occasionally you find people commenting on this. And so, when the kind of pandemic hit and kind of fieldwork came to a grinding halt, and I had a bit more time on my hands to kind of think about putting this together, I started to kind of dive in greater detail and assemble large amounts of information about where and when gold is found in the South Caucasus. So the essential questions that I was dealing with was, number one, is this a real phenomenon? Is this reflective of actual gold use, or is it just an artifact of, say, uneven archaeological research patterns or other factors affecting the deposition of gold in the archaeological record? Also, what are the sort of more precise chronological and spatial parameters of this abandonment or this discontinuance, I would say? How and why did this happen? Is it, there are a number of different hypotheses, potential hypotheses for why gold seems to have disappeared. But I really wanted to kind of test this in a more robust quantitative fashion. And the last question is, what is this this episode, its case study of technological discontinuance, tell us about kind of broader phenomena? What does it kind of tell us about technology and innovation? So those are the kind of 3 or 4 kind of key elements that I want to deal with for the rest of the talk. So the kind of data sources here that I kind of gathered data on the quantities, the chronology, and the kind of types of artifacts and their contexts. It comes from about 125 years of archaeological research in the Caucasus. I went all the way back to the kind of late 19th century, Jacques de Morgan and some kind of German-Austrian projects in the region, and went back and collected data on where gold appears, what the contexts are, what the chronology is, and kind of how many objects. I generally stuck to, I started with the earliest gold objects, and I went to it about 500 BC. And that's because after 500 BC, it becomes increasingly difficult to quantify gold objects. People tend to say, oh, there are, more than 1,000 beads in this grave. Now, there's one particular grave from Bani, classical era grave, that has literally more than 1,000 gold objects in it. But the exact quantities, more difficult to come by and quantify. So I'm dealing with, up to about 500 BC from the earliest gold. And in kind of assembling this data, there are a number of kind of difficulties that one confronts when dealing with legacy data, and choices that one has to make when kind of bringing all this data together. You're often, fortunately, in gold is a kind of often sought after find. So when people find it in excavation, they usually publish it. They usually say something about it if they find gold at a site. So that's working for us. It's not, some sites you might have things that were found but didn't actually make it into the final publication or even a more brief summary. So that's working for us when we're dealing with gold. We have to make decisions about fragmented objects or composite objects, things like necklaces and beads. And this becomes a challenge because we often aren't entirely sure whether a collection of beads was made into one necklace or two. So in terms of repeatability, I decided to list kind of composite objects separately. So individual beads in a necklace were kind of separately entered into the database. So that necklace from Ananauri, consisted of a pendant, 4 of these kind of double spiral beads, but anything that was like clearly separate got its own entry into the database. We're also dealing with things like numerical imprecision to some extent. I alluded to that. It becomes more of a problem in the later period. So they mention things, quotations like beads of carnelian paste and gold. Does that mean more than one bead of gold, or one gold and many beads of carnelian? These kinds of linguistic imprecisions. And so essentially what I did was I used images wherever possible to get a definitive or at least a minimum figure. And if there weren't images and the things were listed in the plural, I was very conservative about my numbers, so I listed things as two, as being two objects if it's listed in the plural, but no other information. There are also issues of spatial and chronological precision with regards to sites. The vast majority, fortunately, the vast majority of the objects in the database that I collected did come from excavated context, which is great. Most of them are graves. Not a whole lot of kind of accidental finds or finds where the context isn't really known, which is quite nice. Generally speaking, acknowledging that there are kind of many variations and kind of in the chronologies, especially across the region, in different parts of the region, different academic traditions. I tended to favor the kind of coarsest chronological groupings because number one, that kind of showed the main kind of structure and patterning that I was looking for, and two, it was difficult to kind of sometimes match up these very early excavations with kind of later ones with carbon dates and things like that. So I favored the coarser chronological divisions rather than trying to get into the really fine-grained things. So the emphasis here was on making sure things were consistent and repeatable and also conservative. So kind of getting a kind of lower bound for these things when there's a little bit of uncertainty. So in total, I collected information about approximately 4,500 gold objects from 89 sites spanning, as I said, about 4,000 to 500 BC. And I divided the South Caucasus into kind of four main regions based on geography and the kind of patterns of gold use. Kind of Western Caucasus, which corresponds to Caucasus, a kind of Middle Kura zone, a Middle Araxes zone, and the kind of Eastern Caucasus. And that Eastern Caucasus is mostly just kind of comprises of two sites in the kind of Tbilisi area. So not so much data on that Eastern Caucasus zone. So I'm going to go through kind of different periods and kind of show the patterning and kind of summarize the patterning in gold usage and where it appears. So starting from about this kind of earliest period, from about 4,000 to 500 BC, gold starts to appear in the region. You get some in both the Middle Kura and Middle Araxes zone, usually in fairly small quantities, but beads, small spirals, and things like that. However, this is a time when the well-known gold mine at Tbilisi in southern Georgia, so it's just kind of in the Middle Kura zone. They're kind of close to that large accumulation. That's not Tbilisi, that's actually Soyuk Bulak in northwestern Azerbaijan, where there are a number of gold beads that were found at this site. And just to kind of orient you to the way that the symbology of this graph, the size of the black circles corresponds to the number of objects, where the kind of shading, the kind of the more warm the colors towards red, the kind of higher densities of gold objects. So I've plotted these kind of two things simultaneously to kind of give you a good visualization, both of the number of objects and also the number of sites. But with this visualization, I've kind of clipped it fairly low. There are sites with many more, hundreds of gold objects in them. I've clipped it fairly low to about be about 50, simply because the finds of sites with very large quantities, individual sites with very large quantities of gold objects, are more likely to be the result of archaeological happenstance. You happen to find a very rich kurgan that happened not to be looted, and so the difference, say, between 200 objects and 600 objects is not as significant as the difference between, say, 10 objects and 210 objects, even though the absolute difference is 200 objects. It's the kind of relative difference that is, I think, quite significant. Gold metals is clearly getting a start during this period, but it's really in the period 2500 to 1500 BC, which corresponds, roughly to what I call the Middle Bronze Age, is when gold really takes off in both the Middle Kura and the Middle Araxes zone, with a little bit kind of petering over into the Western Caucasus in the kind of Caucasus area. And this is kind of the heyday of Bronze Age gold working. You have both a large number of objects and objects, worked using complex technologies, including casting, wire work, which is sometimes called filigree. We have granulation, these kind of technology that involves adhering very tiny spheres of metal to the surface, to a metal surface. So you get granulation, you get complex kind of embossed patterns. You've got gold, sheathing over kind of probably organic things. You've got these, incredibly complex designs. Composite objects of gold used with carnelian, as shown in this beautiful gold cup from Trialeti. That's in the Middle Kura zone. And so this is the kind of real kind of high point in this period, both in numbers of sites and quantities of gold objects. In the late Bronze and early Iron Age, so we're moving to about 1500 to 800 BC, this pattern changes quite significantly. In the south, in the kind of Middle Araxes zone and the kind of surrounding foothills and mountains of the Lesser Caucasus range, you actually see quite a bit of continuity in gold working. There seems to be, a fair amount still present in the archaeological record there. But in the Middle Kura zone, this tradition largely disappears. So in absolute terms, we're talking about going from about 1,200 gold objects in the middle, recorded in my database in the Middle Bronze Age, to less than 30. And for about 34 sites, I think, to just a handful with gold objects. So both the number of sites with gold and the absolute quantities of those sites goes down precipitously in the Middle Kura zone. Coming into the kind of middle, sometimes called the Middle Iron Age or Iron Age 2, you start to see the first kind of glimmering, the emergence of gold working in Caucasus. This is the kind of ramp up to the classical, the brilliant classical gold working tradition. You can see the example here of these two beautiful earrings from that classical period. But the two rings up at the top are from a kind of a site dated from the 8th, 7th, 6th centuries BC. So you can see this tradition emerging in this area. There's some evidence of recovery of gold working technologies in the Middle Kura zone. Doesn't really show up well quantitatively, but unequivocally by the kind of by the classical and Hellenistic period, you have large quantities of gold reappearing in the Middle Kura zone. So just to kind of give you an overview of what we've seen so far, this is kind of a map of the patterning. Explosion in the Middle Bronze Age, drop in the Middle Kura zone in the Late Bronze Age, and then the kind of reemergence in the later Iron Age, with Caucasus coming online. But the Middle Araxes zone, this kind of region farther south, seems to show quite a bit more stability in gold working technologies. And so this kind of bifurcation is especially interesting because both the kind of Middle Kura zone and the Middle Araxes zone actually share quite a lot of different aspects of material culture. This is sometimes termed the Chashen Tzitelgor or Chashen Metzamor tradition in the kind of Late Bronze and early Iron Age. Just visualized quantitatively here, you can see a kind of map of total quantities of objects for these different regions in different periods. Note that the scale on the Y scale there is actually a log scale. So to kind of illustrate that the most important differences are order of magnitude changes in the quantities of gold work. So there you see the drop from about 1,200 to less than 30 in the Middle Kura zone. in that kind of transition to around 1500 BC. So now our question, really becomes, is this pattern real, or is it just an issue of archaeological visibility? So what exactly do we mean by archaeological visibility? And we can kind of think about this in several different ways and use that to interrogate the data set and think about these issues in more detail. One possibility is, what if it's just an artifact of patterns of archaeological research? Maybe people just haven't excavated late Bronze Age, early Iron Age sites in the Middle Chorazin. Well, if you know the area and the kind of tradition of research, that's definitively not true. There's huge numbers of late Bronze and early Iron Age sites, in this Middle Chorazin, during this period. So it's not a question of archaeologists just haven't looked there. You might ask, what if they aren't burying their dead in graves? There are plenty of ways of disposing of dead that may not leave an archaeological signature. And as I said, gold often shows up in graves, so maybe they stop. Maybe we don't, have good visibility of graves in this period. Well, that also is not true. Late Bronze, early Iron Age graves in this period are extremely common. Estimated in the thousands that have been excavated, possibly even the tens of thousands. I mean, there are some cemeteries where you have hundreds of graves dating this period. Okay, so you might ask, okay, maybe it's not that they aren't burying their dead in graves, but maybe they have kind of a austere burial tradition. Maybe they just have a tradition of using things in life, but they don't bury their dead with objects. Maybe it's kind of a cultural prohibition against putting things in graves. Well, again, if you know the mortuary record of the late Bronze and early Iron Age, there are plenty of grave goods. They have no problem burying their dead with lots of nice things, beads, pots, items of food, items of metalwork, just not gold. So there's that again suggests that something specific about gold. Now you might say, okay, well maybe they're okay with depositing grave goods, but maybe there's something culturally specific about gold, that they don't put gold in graves, and that's why we're not seeing, because so much of the gold that we have comes from graves. Okay, yeah, I mean there are kind of unavoidable factors affecting the archaeological curriculum. A lot of the gold that we do have does come from graves, but in fact, if you look at the other depositional contexts in which we find metal, so shrines and hoards, dating to this period, we don't find gold in those either. So as far as we can tell, it doesn't seem like there's any kind of places where gold is being deposited in the ground in the archaeological record. And in addition, as I mentioned, gold is found quite frequently in graves farther to the south, so in this kind of middle Araxes zone, areas with very similar material culture. And to me, I read this as a kind of evidence that it's not really a cultural prohibition. They just if they have it, they put it in the graves along with all this other stuff that they're putting in graves at this time. So you can follow these questions and getting more and more specific and kind of trying to construct a kind of conceivable, but I would say not very likely scenario where somehow gold is available in the community at this time, but somehow it's just not making its way into the burial. And indeed, you might say, like, oh, maybe gold is quite valuable, and that's why it's not being deposited. Well, if it's quite valuable, it's probably quite rare. It's probably not used very much, and so this gets you all sort of end up in the same place, basically. That this is this large scale database shows that it's not really a question of archaeological visibility. I think this is a real reflection of the discontinuance of gold use at this time. So now we have to turn to the question of why. Why was gold discontinued in this region at this particular time? And so there's several hypotheses that are worth looking into in more detail and testing carefully. One is that perhaps there's a kind of loss of access to gold resources. Maybe there are trade routes that they're importing gold to the region. Those trade routes break down for whatever reason in the late Bronze Age, so they lose access to the supply of resources. And this is a possible model for technological discontinuance kind of worldwide. You can think of kind of collapse of empires, that kind of thing, connectivity and trade routes being really important for maintaining technological traditions. So that's one that I wanted to consider. I also wanted to consider some possible demographic factors. This is a kind of model that's come out of evolutionary approaches to technology. This idea that if in very small populations of practitioners, the kind of imperfect dynamics of transmission of technological knowledge can actually lead to the kind of degrading of technological knowledge, also ultimately the loss of technological knowledge. This model has been critiqued quite a bit, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I wanted to at least kind of consider that factor. And the last hypothesis is that this is a socially driven rejection. It's something that's actively rejected in this region. It's not a kind of passive loss of technology, but something people are saying, explicitly saying no to. So these are the three hypotheses. And I want to consider the first one. And I did this by modeling kind of access to gold deposits in the region. And I chose this by collecting, spatial data on known gold deposits in the region. I would have, ideally liked to do this, carefully and chronologically, with, knowing which gold deposits were exploited at which time. Unfortunately, mining archaeology in the region, and indeed globally, is often very difficult to make these chronological determinations about what was being used when, without really intensive investigation. So that fantastic Georgian-German project working on this one mine in Tbilisi for 15 years, and they've done a really good job of showing when that mine was in operation. But it's difficult to extrapolate this on a kind of landscape or kind of regional scale. So I chose maps of geological or gold deposits as a kind of proxy for accessibility, because we know that even in the early Bronze Age, even 3000 BC, miners were able to extract gold from deep subsurface deposits. Sometimes up to, I think the deepest shafts of this period get down like 30 meters below the ground surface, so very deep. And they're seem to be extracting gold from relatively low-grade deposits. So that suggests that they have a lot of technical capacity when it comes to mining. So it's maybe not a perfect analogy, but looking at kind of the distribution of gold deposits is a good proxy for accessibility of gold to different regions. And one thing that you'll see by looking at this map, looking at the kind of gold, the gray triangles there are gold deposits, is that gold is quite accessible in this kind of the two kind of middle zones here. There's lots of gold deposits in this kind of middle Kura zone, which sees this abandonment in the late Bronze Age. So on kind of first glance, we're not too convinced that access to ore deposits is going to be a factor. But I think it's worth testing this a little bit farther, being more rigorous with our determinations. So I did this by kind of using finding the least cost path from the path from the gold deposit to each archaeological site. So the gray lines here indicate the kind of path, the quickest path from the site to the nearest gold deposit. And by mapping the kind of quantities of gold against the walking time from the nearest gold deposit, we can see essentially that there's not a whole lot of difference between the Middle Bronze Age and the Late Bronze Age. We see a kind of rough decline in the kind of very largest sites with the very largest quantities of gold tend to be on the closer side to deposit to known gold deposits. As you get farther away, the quantities of gold decrease, which is sort of as you'd expect. But the other thing to note is that nowhere in the South Caucasus is very far from a gold deposit. This is in walking time, model walking time in hours. So most of the region is within a couple of days of a gold deposit. But the kind of big takeaway here is that there doesn't seem to be much difference between the kind of Middle Bronze Age and the Late Bronze Age. Another way of looking at this data, and I should say this is, there's no the kind of least cost time from each deposit is roughly the same. There's no statistically significant difference in distance to deposit for the Middle Kura and Middle Araxes zones. These two regions would bifurcate significantly in their gold use at this time. So it doesn't seem to be any differences in access between these two areas. Another way of looking at it is to say that if trade and supply restrictions are a major factor in the declines that we see, we would expect to see that areas farther from deposits are going to experience the largest relative drops in gold quantities from the Middle Bronze Age to the Late Bronze Age. So just kind of schematically shown here, you can imagine you have sort of a fall-off curve. If this were true, you'd expect to see a smaller relative decline in the areas closest because they still have access to gold. But areas farther away would have a much larger drop. So looking at this in kind of tabular form from the actual data, you can look at the Middle Kura and the Middle Araxes zone, and the kind of relative, the items highlighted in kind of red there are the relative declines in quantities of gold for kind of binned data according to kind of hours from deposit. So the 0 to 4 hours, you have the both absolute and relative declines between the Middle and Late Bronze Age shown here. And essentially what you're seeing is that in the Middle Kura zone, the relative declines are steep kind of across the board. So even 99% of 99% decline in gold objects found at sites between 0 and 4 hours from a deposit. Similarly, 100, as you go across line, doesn't seem to be a whole lot of change. The distance from deposit doesn't seem to be affecting how steep the decline is in that Middle Kura zone. Similarly, in the Middle Araxes zone, you don't see a pattern. You also don't see a pattern, right? You have some areas that you see increasing amounts of gold use, some areas that see declines. You'll notice that some of those dashes there in the kind of relative declines are because you go from kind of 0 objects to a finite number of objects, which means that effectively, in percentage terms, it's an infinite % increase. And so that's the kind of indication there with the superscript A and A's there. And so there's, similarly with the Middle Araxes, there doesn't seem to be any distinct, clear pattern in those relative declines. And actually, the definitive, the deciding factor in whether a region, experiences decline in gold is, whether it's in that Middle Kura zone or in that Middle Araxes zone. So this, all this goes to say that there really isn't any good, robust evidence for access to gold or trade routes or some of these kinds of kind of cutting off of supply as being a factor in discontinuance. So let's consider the question of demographic factors. And we can talk about this Heinrich paper that kind of laid out this model. There were a number of issues with the data he was using, and it's sort of been kind of critiqued. But is this a case where the population is declining, perhaps, and maybe it's under pressure, and so either the number of gold practitioners or the number of people is declining in this period. And kind of all proxies of evidence that we have suggest that this is not the case. In the Late Bronze, Early Iron Age, you see a proliferation of settlements, of fortresses, and very large quantities of evidence of an increasing population. So certainly not the population as a whole. In addition, there's evidence of kind of innovation and increases in the scale of production when it comes to other kinds of metal production. So if you're familiar with my work out in Western Georgia on copper smelting sites, this is really well documented here. Huge numbers of sites, all with radiocarbon dates right in that kind of roughly 1300 to 800 BC period. Really explosion of really well documented metal production, just not gold. Looking, so Caucasus is not in this Middle Kura zone. But you see similar patterns there, although the evidence for production isn't as robust there. There are metallurgical workshops known from Kemo-Volnisi, Kemo-Kedi, and a couple of other places in the area. Certainly very large quantities of copper and bronze objects in the archaeological record at this time really suggests that the that craftspeople, there's not a kind of demographic constriction on craftspeople, especially metal workers, and the kind of transmission of technologies. So that also suggests these demographic factors are kind of unsatisfactory. So let's take a look at the kind of third hypothesis, the social drivers of rejection. And to really understand what's going on here, we need to kind of look a little bit at the kind of broader archaeology of this region and what's happening in the kind of middle to late Bronze Age transition. So it will be very familiar to many of you, but the Middle Bronze Age is extremely well known for its very large kurgan burials. These photos are from a fantastic Georgian project, Georgian National Museum project, excavating enormous kurgan in Ananauri. It's more than 100 meters in diameter, 12 meters tall. You can perhaps see the tiny little meter scale bar at the bottom of that giant section of kurgan. These are enormous burial mounds with clearly intended to kind of glorify the deceased. Quite a lot of concentration of labor in kind of raising these monuments for kind of individual elite individuals. They put I wanted to show some kind of older excavations here. If you're more a stone person than an earthen person, well, there are enormous stone built kurgans as well in southern Georgia. Fantastic kurgans from Zertaketi. These are often filled with burial carts. There's lots of gold found in these burials. It's very much intimately the gold working traditions in these are very much intimately connected with these burial rituals and the kind of most likely the kind of rituals of the living societies in which that built these burial mounds. Gold is kind of just one of a number of indicators of the kind of elite status of these individuals. Huge numbers of kind of grave offerings. These are, I believe, hazelnuts from the Ananauri Big Kurgan number 3. Very well preserved in this case, but it's not certain by no means the only one in the region, but just a fantastic example. So in the late Bronze Age, this kind of changes. You have these Urle kurgans and this Trialeti kurgans. Kind of this burial tradition kind of just disappears, and you see the reemergence of settled life in the region. So in a period that had very few settlements, we see now in around 1500 BC the reemergence of settled life. We see the construction of very large monumental fortresses, often with very large, thick cyclopean walls. I've shown a couple of examples here. But what's interesting about these fortresses is they don't actually, while they are kind of extremely monumentally impressive, they don't actually seem to display the kind of same degree of emphasis on kind of elite individuals. So just to kind of give an example, they don't show to the same degree this sort of centralization of authority in a small number of individuals. It's interesting to compare these kind of plans of late Bronze Age fortresses, which have been, a number of them have been mapped. Not that many have been excavated, unfortunately, although that is changing. But it's interesting to compare the plans of these fortresses, which often have very impressive walls. But inside you have these agglutinative kind of structures, usually relatively small rooms, all the same, that kind of contrast quite significantly from both contemporary fortresses and citadels in the late Bronze Age and kind of subsequent Iron Age fortresses of the, say, Urartian period, where you have these very regimented complexes, kind of unitary complexes built kind of with a kind of overarching plan that are clearly intended to, administer, to be kind of arm of the administrative state, palaces, storerooms, that kind of thing. We don't seem to have those in those Middle Bronze Age. So, in the same way with the graves in the late Bronze Age, we don't see the same size of graves. These monumental kurgans don't really happen anymore. Graves are smaller. They're often kind of flat cromlechs and smaller kurgans. That's not to say that they don't have very nice things in them. These, as I mentioned earlier, they have no qualms about putting nice things in graves. But there's not the same degree of kind of evidence of social hierarchy, this emphasis on the kind of individual. Again, like lots of crafting technologies, just not gold. And so in the kind of broad sweep of things, the hypothesis, the kind of working hypothesis that I have is that there's something about this association of gold with this kurgan, highly hierarchical, elite kurgan building tradition that in the late Bronze Age is in fact kind of turned away from or rejected. And it's because of gold's deep association with this kurgan burial tradition that it kind of dissipates in this region. So it's like, I think it's a kind of intentional social rejection in this middle Kura zone. It would be interesting, like, it's interesting to note that like this kind of pattern and transition, is also generally reflective of areas farther to the south that did actually maintain gold tradition. So it's understanding kind of why these two regions diverge is a kind of question, I think, for future research and discussion. But to kind of wrap up, what does this case study of Caucasus Gold tell us about technological discontinuance and rejection? Well, I think that it changes our impression about the kind of social circumstances in which technological discontinuance can occur. I think a lot of times we associate the loss of technologies declining, with kind of the end of empires, social collapse, these kinds of things. Classic examples, the kind of disappearance of wheel-made pottery after the end of the Roman Empire in Britain, or the loss of kind of plastering, large-scale plastering technologies in the Maya world after the kind of collapse of major Mayan urban centers. And so I think we tend to associate technological loss with these contexts. But actually, I think the case of Caucasus Gold shows that it can happen in a much wider variety of social circumstances. I don't think, and this is because I don't think anybody would characterize the kind of proliferation of settlements, the kind of efflorescence of crafting technologies in the late Bronze Age as a kind of collapse of a kind of broader social collapse. This is not stated there is conflict, and the fortresses are indications of that. But I would doubt, I would argue that in the late Bronze Age is a period of demographic expansion. I would say relative prosperity. They're building lots of structures and making lots of things. So I think this tells us that technological rejection can happen actually in a much wider range of social circumstances than one might originally suspect. So the kind of research that I've discussed in this paper was it's been published in Scientific Reports last fall, and indeed there's a kind of paper written more towards an enthusiast audience that actually came out today in Current World Archaeology. So that's very good timing, not something I planned, but very good timing. So that article has a lot of really nice photographs, some of which you've seen here today, and I'm deeply grateful to the many colleagues and friends who helped provide me with these photographs. So there are a number of people who are greatly helpful in kind of assembling, this information and kind of critiquing my hypotheses, especially with the context of pandemics. I had a lot of people that were sending me obscure PDFs and kind of helping me track down those obscure sources from 130 years ago. And so many thanks to those and for the photo credits. And I believe wrapping up now, and I believe if Magda is here, she's very kindly agreed to give a Georgian summary. If I may say one more thing, one of the kind of lovely and charming things that I learned in doing this was that the Georgian word for like granulation or object with granulation is svareti, which is quite similar to the kind of, or I believe, I'm told, is quite similar to the word for kind of dew glistening on a leaf. So I think this is quite a bit more poetic than the English word for granulation, which sounds kind of sandy and that uncomfortable feeling when you go to the beach and have wet sand stuck on your hand. And, anyway, I think the kind of Georgian term for it is far more beautiful and poetic than the English one. I thought that was a kind of charming anecdote from my research on this topic. And so happy to end there and maybe hand it over to Magda.
Hello. Should I give short summary?
Please.
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. პრეზენტაციაში წარმოდგენილი იყო სიახლეები, რომელიც არქეოლოგიურ მატერიალურ კულტურაშია დღესდღეობით წარმოდგენილი. საკვლევ საგანს წარმოადგენდა ტექნოლოგია, რომელსაც დღესდღეობით ნაკლები ყურადღება ეთმობა და ნაკლები დისკუსიებია წარმოდგენილი ამ დარგში. რატომ არის კავკასია ამ თვალსაზრისით მნიშვნელოვანი, კერძოდ კი მეტალურგიული თვალსაზრისით, ვინაიდან კავკასიაში არის წარმოდგენილი უამრავი მეტალურგია, კარგად არის განვითარებული, ხვდებით დიდი რაოდენობით ბრინჯაოს, ანთიმონს და მისი განვითარების გზები, კერძოდ კი კავშირები ახლო აღმოსავლეთ ქვეყნებთან და მეზობელ რეგიონებთან. ასევე ნათანიელი ხაზს უსვავს, რომ ოქროს მეტალურგიასთან დაკავშირებით საუბრობს საწმისის პარადოქსზე, სადაც მოხსენიებული აქვს იაზონის მითი ოქროს საწმისზე და შემდეგ უშუალოდ გადადის ოქროს არტეფაქტებზე, რომელიც წარმოდგენილია გვიან ბრინჯაოს და ადრე რკინის ხანაში. და მაგალითად მოყავს საქართველოს ეროვნულ მუზეუმში ასახული სხვადასხვა არტეფაქტები. რაც შეეხება უშუალოდ მონაცემთა ბაზას, იგი თავის კვლევის დროს ხელმძღვანელობდა 7 ენაზე შესრულებულ სხვადასხვა არქეოლოგიურ ნამუშევრებს და ასევე მუზეუმში არსებულ გამოფენაზე არსებულ არტეფაქტების შესწავლითაც იყო დაკავებული. რაც შეეხება ტექნოლოგიურ პარადოქსს, რომელიც იგი ასახელებს თავის პრეზენტაციაში, მას მოყავს ორი მოსაზრება. პირველი მოსაზრების მიხედვით ნივთები, რომელიც უშუალოდ დაკრძალვის დროს არის წარმოდგენილი, ასახავდა სოციალურ სტატუსს, ანუ ოქროს თვალსაზრისით და ასევე ტექნოლოგია გამოხატული იყო ოქროს არ ჩატანება, ასე რომ ვთქვათ, დაკრძალვის რიტუალის დროს გულისხმობდა იმას, რომ იგი საკმაოდ მნიშვნელოვანი იყო საზოგადოებისთვის და ღირებული. ასევე წარმოდგენილი აქვს რუკა, სადაც ასახულია ოქროს არტეფაქტები, რომელიც დანაწევრებული აქვს რეგიონების მიხედვით და მისი გეოლოგიური წყაროს, ანუ აღმოჩენის ადგილების მიხედვით მოყვანილი აქვს საყდრისი და კიდევ საუბრობს ქვემო ქართლის, ქვემო ქედის მეტალურგიაზე, მაგრამ იგი ამ წყაროს მიხედვით, გეოლოგიურ წყაროს მიხედვით ეხება მხოლოდ მეტალურგიას, რომელიც არ მოიცავს უშუალოდ ოქროს და მოიცავს სპილენძს, ანთიმონს და ასე შემდეგ. ასევე შუა ბრინჯაოს და გვიან ბრინჯაოს ხანაზე ამახვილებს ყურადღებას. შუა ბრინჯაოს ხანაში ძირითად ყურადღებას უთმობს სამარხებს, კერძოდ კი ანანაურის ყორღანს და გვიან ბრინჯაოს ხანაში, რომ ხვდებით, გვიან ბრინჯაოს და ადრე რკინის ხანაში ძირითადად ყურადღება გამახვილებულია დემოგრაფიულ ფაქტორებზე, როგორიც არის ციხესიმაგრეები, მოსახლეობის სოციალური მდგომარეობა და ამ პერიოდში შედარებით ნაკლები ყურადღება ეთმობა ტექნოლოგიას. მესამე ჰიპოთეზის მიხედვით, რომელიც მას აქვს წარმოდგენილი, საზოგადოება უარყოფს ამ ტექნოლოგიას და ადგილობრივ ინტერპრეტაციის მიხედვით გამოყოფს, ადგილობრივი ფაქტორების მიხედვით იგი ხაზს უსვავს იმ ფაქტს, რომ ამ პერიოდში ხდება ტექნოლოგია გაუჩინარების პირას არის და ეს მიტყველებს საზოგადოების დაცემაზე, ასე რომ ვთქვათ, და შემდგომ უშუალოდ გადადის, ასე რომ ვთქვათ, დასასრულს მოყვანილი აქვს მისი კვლევები თავისი სტატიებიდან და კიდევ ერთხელ ხაზს უსვავს, რომ ტექნოლოგიის გაუჩინარება მეტყველებს სოციალურ დაცემაზე უშუალოდ საზოგადოებასთან მიმართებაში. Yes, that's it. I hope it was nice.
Thank you very much to both Nat and to Magda for giving us that wonderful lecture. If I could have people use the raise hand